Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Unity in diversity is something Indians have had drummed into them from childhood. Textbooks talk almost ad nauseum about the diversity of India's peoples, its religions, its languages. But while the diversity of India is a matter of great pride, there is also a concurrent anxiety about too much mixing. Intercaste, interfaith, interethnic group marriages remain a perennial source of tension. Conversion has become a political hot-button issue rather than a personal decision of faith. Now imagine one family tree that includes one of India's so-called criminal tribes relegated to the bottom of the caste hierarchy, Christian missionaries, and Muslims of aristocratic lineage. That tree could tell the story of India, or it could be the tree no one wants in their backyard. Nusrat F. Jafri tells this story of caste and conversion in her family memoir, This Land We Call Home. And she joins us on the show. Nusrat Jafri, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for calling me and having me here.
Just the names in your book of your family members give us some clue about how complicated your family tree is. Hardayal, Prudence, Abid, Hannah, Meera, Nusrat, and then finally Dylan, Jafri, Roy. I was curious, how hard was it research-wise to go up that tree? Like in the West, one can trace one's family tree back to Norman conquest or whatever. In India, it's much harder, especially if you're just Aam Aadmi, not descended from the Nawab of Oudh or something.
It wasn't hard for me, honestly, because I think the paternal side is very well documented, of course. My maternal side, up till Hardayal and his parents, it was decently documented in oral stories, of course. The paternal side has written documentation also.
And let's start with the maternal side, because your book begins with Hardayal Singh, your great-grandfather. And there's a very arresting image you begin with where you talk about his imposing handlebar mustache, like the Rajputs.
We've grown up with only seeing his photographs. And there are photographs in the book as well. And when you see him, he's like this really broad-shouldered guy who stands really proud and tall. And in the memory of my mother, he is broader and taller. So you grow up with a certain image. And when you look at the photographs, it kind of matches. And also the fact that he was mistaken for a very famous Bhantu robber, thief called Sultana Daku, who was actually the opposite him in just physical frame, but his stories of valor of standing up against the British and the higher caste Hindu society was so big always in folklore that you were like, okay, this is nice. They make very good stories. His Hardayal stories, his stories of resilience were known to us, that their camps were burned and then they traveled to Uttar Pradesh, adopted a new religion. So, if you're as a child who was keen in this history, I was always fascinated. I was fascinated by the way he looked and what he stood for.
We've had Yashika Dutt on our show, whom you refer to in the book, and coming out as Dalit. And one of the things she writes about is because the family hid that identity, chose the name Dutt, they went to great pains so that people didn't even really know that they were Dalit. It was something that was hidden away. Since your great-grandfather had also converted, but as part of family history, were you always aware that he was from the Bhantu tribe, which was known as a criminal tribe? Or was there also a sort of attempt to, with his handlebar mustache, to make him a Rajput and sort of erase that history?
A lot of Bhantus actually identify themselves as Bhantu Rajputs or Rajput Bhantus. So this is a concession they earned over the years. And in the book, I have referred to this gentle process in history, which is called Rajputization. So if you were to meet a Bhatu even today who identifies as a Bhatu Rajput, they would be identifying themselves as just that. Identity, caste, and your social standing, they intersect at so many points that you don't have any specific divisions or lines that can, just be laid out in black and white. So there are these gray areas. So for Bhatu Rajputs, that's what they are. So for a lot of my relatives, it might have been a revelation when I mentioned the process of Rajputization. Of course, the Christian relatives had moved ahead from the shadows of caste to a great extent. But even then, in their memory, when they were retelling, it was always we were Bhatu Rajputs and a lot of pride in being Rajput. And it was always known to me about how these castes and how these tribes and many other tribes were criminalized by the British. That was known. A little bit about the valor of Bhatus was also known. But I don't know if it is concealing or how much of it was told to them in their childhood, because Indian relationships with parents are also so, opaque, that in the earlier times, a lot of the answers that my uncles and my mother were giving me were, we didn't ask our parents. And there was no culture of speaking about things. So information was usually given by the parent, and rarely would the child go and, question more.
Do you remember what was the first question that you had about your family tree?
I was actually fascinated with my paternal side to begin with, because we were ancestors of Aga Mir, who was the prime minister of Nasruddin. And there's a lot of, richness to this. And I remember asking my father when he was around about the history of that family. And there's this very famous photograph, a painting. If you do a Google search, you'll see this Nawab is sitting and this guy, Aga Mir, is standing behind in all these royal clothes. So I was fascinated with that. But as my studies on caste increased, my realization that I have so much more to read into this and into my own personal history was sparked. So my interest in my maternal side was actually ignited by the political events of India, and not in the last 10 years, in the last many decades. When I was 19 or when I was 18, 19, when I was leaving school and coming to Delhi, that's when I realized, words like conversion and what kind of baggage they hold in Indian political social context.
So the tribe that Hardayal Singh was from, the Bhatus, it was one of the 150 tribes that the British government notified as criminal tribes. So on what basis were they notified as criminal?
They were also divided into communities. A large part of them were indeed involved in thieving, in robberies. I met this very famous, respected scholar and Bhatu activist called Dakshin Chahara. He is also Bhatu. Bhatus are also called Chaharas in Ahmedabad. And Dakshin was telling me about these elaborate skirts, ghagras that Bhatu women used to wear with multiple pockets that were so well concealed and could hold very heavy objects without it looking lopsided and as a giveaway to the police or to common people. But you can't generalize that all Bhatus were doing this, or all Bhils were into certain activities, or all Banjaras were just singing and dancing. But the history of Bhatus, interestingly, as Dakshin told me, were initially, now the term is a little derogatory, bhans, which are street performers, dancers. That's where they started from. And then lack of opportunities, difficult caste system, and the colonial rulers, government coming in, made life even more difficult. So a lot of this was dependent on survival, depending on what we could do to attract or to just survive. Hardayal and his clan had large herds of cattle, livestock. They were herders and pastoralists. They can't be thieves at the same time because it's very difficult to escape with so many cattle as well. But there were indeed people who were doing this. They would overnight change their address, and they would, like Sultana Daku, who was also Bhatu, was also renowned for disguises. And they were all this story about them stealing and bringing it back to the community, stealing from the rich Banya class. That's all recorded and somewhat true. I also wanted to say the need for British to criminalize a lot of tribes, around 200 actually, is also coming from the need to sedentarize people. So the caste system has this formulated system where you have readers, scholars, workers, fighters, warriors, and there are a whole lot of people, communities that did not adhere, did not want to come into this fold and became outcasts and were not sedentary. They didn't want to get settled. They were nomads. British were inherently scared of tribes post 1857 that refused to stay in one place. So they wanted this increased surveillance and profiling to an extent where they wanted your thumbprints. They invented the thumbprints in India to a large extent. So these things were then brought in to gentrify and forcefully make people stay in one place. So a Bhantu community clan, if it was traveling and wanted to stay in, say, some village in Rajasthan, they would have to come and take permission from the police and be allowed to only camp 2 kilometers away from the periphery of the main village because they were profiled to be thieves or criminals. You cannot just blame it on the British doing that. It's also society that lent to this discrimination.
So what did the Criminal Tribes Act actually do? When you were when a group tribe like the Bhantu is designated a criminal tribes, what does it mean for them?
So when the British started these series of acts from the 1871 onwards till up to 1926 or so, they put a stamp of criminality on a large section of people who weren't fitting into the established caste system. This was something that added a lifelong stigma to them. Even if you migrate to something else, a criminal tribe tag not only just makes life difficult for a large section of people who are largely nomads or tribals not adhering to the Hindu caste system. It has psychological impacts on them. It also has societal impacts because you are being profiled. If I may take, we denotified criminal tribes in 1852.
That was 1952, right?
Sorry, 1952, yeah. It's been so many years since 1952, but the prejudice continues. Even today, as I would again go back to Dakshin, who's because the most prominent voice here, and I mentioned this in the book as well, that on paper, Bhantu or other criminal tribes don't exist on the map for development purposes, education. But if there is a crime in the neighborhood, the police are the first to land up on their doorsteps. So this is a legacy of the Criminal Tribes Act, so deeply ingrained in the police system, which is very, very colonial. So it did a lot than just label them that time. It planted this stereotype in the minds of all of us as well, that it's very difficult to undo that now.
You said you were aware of your family history, but were you also conscious about that stereotype? Is it something like, would you talk to classmates about that part of the history?
I wasn't this caste aware when I was growing up because I grew up Muslim, very privileged. I didn't know that Islam, the Muslims in the Indian subcontinent also adhere to a caste system, which is largely based on class as well, which is also a legacy of caste system in India. There were other things taking precedence in my growing up years. Now, of course, for the past many years in my adulthood, I've been very proud and telling people because I find it so fascinating as well, because I find the journey of my family interesting and intriguing. But as a child, I was caste shielded. I had the experience of feeling othered as a Muslim as a child and having to deal with a lot of stereotyping and having to answer for my religion and my culture very often. Yeah.
It's like so many layers of othering in part of this story. And in fact, when you talk about criminal tribes, you mentioned you discovered, was it while researching this book, that Hardayal Singh's grandfather himself was sent to the Andamans, to Kalapani, by the British. Did you ever figure out why he was sent?
No, I didn't figure out why he was sent. But I knew about it vaguely because when you research about Bhatus, very little information is there. Some of it is, of course, that it mentions that there's a considerable population percentage of Bhatus found in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. But when my mother or my Mahmood narrated this to me, it just kind of everything came together and had a bigger impact on me than just the vague story being told in my childhood.
Right.
I don't know the reason why he was sent, because his grandfather was absent from his life as well. And I'm very interested in knowing how so many Bhatus reached Andaman and Nicobar. Yeah, and there might be a story possibly in the pipeline for that.
And Hardayal Singh converts to Christianity because of Methodist missionaries. Many people will look at it and on the face of it say that this was a conversion that was prompted for economic reasons to escape the shackles of caste and stigma. But he actually becomes a minister. Was there a more spiritual yearning that pushed him towards Christianity?
I think there was a lot of gratitude. There was a lot of genuine gratitude in the first missionaries that reached them after the incident. That was like the lowest in their clan's history.
We haven't talked about the incident, and it's always tricky with books because I don't want to give everything away to readers. But maybe you could just briefly, without going into it. So there was a terrible fire that had happened.
Yeah, so there was a terrible fire, and my great-grandfather's community, his clan, was directly affected by it, and they didn't receive any help from the villagers who were barely 2 kilometers. In fact, they had lit their camps. They were responsible for the fire. So when the first missionaries arrived, my great-grandfather, Hardayal, actually saw them as saviors. They were the people who were, without any discrimination, helping them. These were members of the Methodist Episcopal Church who came, extended help and aid to them. At this point, I think when they decided to convert, this was a very deep-rooted final decision of sorts where they were like, we've had enough. We also deserve to progress in our lives. And the Criminal Tribes Acts were not making life any easier for the Bhatus. And because he was educated, he could read and write both English, Urdu. I'm sure that the suggestion to study came from the ministers, from the church people. And I think he took the offer because he wanted to do this further. He wanted to genuinely learn about Christianity. It is difficult to explain because of what conversion has come to become in today's day and age. People look at it as purely political now, but as difficult as it is to imagine, it can be a deeply personal expression. Conversion is a deeply personal act. You can convert on paper and still not feel like following the religion, and you may just do it wholeheartedly.
There are so many stories of conversion as part of the book. In fact, the subhead includes it's about caste and conversion. But just in terms of converting to Christianity, there is Hardayal, who's a Bhantu, on the outcast from larger Hindu society, as it were, converting. But there is, on sort of your maternal grandfather's side, there is also a Brahmin who is converting to Christianity. And that's not for religious reasons. That family's motivation was obviously very different.
Absolutely. I mean, the history of Christianity in India bears witness to the fact that it wasn't always the downtrodden in society who were doing it, because the early Christian conversions happened within the upper caste society, within the Brahmins. And if you were to look at specifically the conversions in Maharashtra, it was the Brahmins who stepped in first. And then there's also evidence of how Brahmins did not appreciate evangelists going into lower caste areas to bring in converts from there as well, because they were like, why are you going there? So caste hierarchy followed into Christianity as a result of that as well. And as far as Masi Dayal, my mother's paternal grandfather, he was a Kannauji Brahmin, which is a very high subcaste within Brahmins. His was, they were poor and they wanted education. Education promises a better life. I mean, that became clear to people in the colonial era. My family history has a lot of evidence of a lot of adults exercising their agency to convert. And I think that is so beautiful and so important in the larger narrative that India is witnessing now.
Hardal has 7 daughters, all of whom go and study and have careers as nurses and things like that. And I was just wondering if at this point, looking back, you can tell whether his converting pushed him in that direction to educate his daughters and give them careers, or perhaps he was that kind of a man anyway, and it wasn't because he became a Christian that he educated his daughters. Can we tell that now?
It's difficult to assess that because his older daughters were not sitting with other upper caste students in class. They used to sit outside, and also they were nomads. So education was still very, it was a luxury at that point for people who were not within the caste system. It's not like becoming a Christian inspired him to become a feminist as well. I don't think that would be the case, but it helped in their favor that after Christianity, doors for education opened up, and being a colonial nation, everyone was aspiring towards an English education. So yeah, these are early 1920s, 1930s. So this is remarkable for that time as well, to send your daughters for schooling and English medium schooling. He must have been a feminist deep down as well.
But also, as you point out in the book, given 7 daughters, most of them ended up, while they all had careers, most of them ended up not getting married. And looking back, do you think that great fear that people had that if you overeducate your daughters, they will not be able to get married, held true for your family? Or was this because these were converts that were made it harder to get married?
I think it's a combination of all the points that you mentioned and the legacy of caste, if I may add. Conversion and how caste follows you into conversion to an extent were also responsible. And also don't forget that, if I may mention, that nursing as a profession, even today, carries the stigma of caste deeply attached to it. Because the lowest in the caste order would be responsible for bodily fluids and excretion. So early on in those days, a person of a certain caste wouldn't want to be a nurse because they're not going to deal with sputum and urine and other body fluids. So this may have largely also contributed to their not getting married. But as far as I know, their stories, they were living their independent lives and enjoying their money. I don't know if anyone was really missing the domesticated environment of a married life in those days. I mean, Prudence did get married.
Which is why you're here, and which is why this book is happening. And modern day critics have also raised a lot of questions about sort of that missionary approach to conversion, educating children of new converts in boarding schools away from, sort of wiping out the parents' original culture and so on and so forth. Was this a part of your family history as well? Was an effort to wipe out, cleanse that Bhantu past?
Subconsciously, yes, I would say, because that's why the Bhatu Rajput identity and not just the Bhatu identity. And you can't blame them because of how Indian society is so deeply rooted in its prejudice and discriminations. But I completely agree with the debate on, do you gentrify a tribe by the norms laid down by society of how they perceive gentrification to be? Or do you take aid to their areas and protect their customs, their language, and bring education to them? Unfortunately, it's not happening that way. Not even today in India. If you want mainstream education, you have to come. I'm talking about tribals here. You have to be uprooted from your villages and you are housed in these dormitories and in these hostels where there's lack of safeguarding your own culture. That's the cost. I would have loved to learn the Bhatu language, which is called Bhatu, but my mother also doesn't know it. And that's a first generation loss there. Hardayal spoke Bhatu language. I don't know how many of the daughters knew it as well. That's a loss that happened because I wasn't curious enough at that point.
But he didn't preach in Bhantu language, right?
No, he didn't preach in Bhartu language. He spoke to the children in Bhartu language for sure, because some of the sentences that came out to me from memory of my relatives, they would speak in this little Rajasthani dialect, which is very close to Bhartu language. He had the Bible in Urdu and English. And I think that's where the preaching would have been. But I'm guessing it in a village in Uttar Pradesh, it would have been in Urdu and not in English.
How did that affect their feelings about the empire? Because one of the interesting things you do in the book is you map your family's history with what is going on in India at that same time. And it's a lot of turbulence in India. Did the conversion affect the feelings of your great aunts and all about the empire?
I've written this in the book as well. They were great empire loyalists.
Does that make it feel awkward for you? Like here now, it's very hard for us to take pride in that, no?
As a student of history in grade 11, because I took history in 11th and 12th, I remember getting into this argument with my Nani Prudence, and she was so offended. She left our house early that day. And her reasoning was pretty much what empire loyalists have, that they gave you the railroad system. And I have written about that in the book, that the same railroad system during the partition became a medium of just exchange of dead bodies at one point. So that great railroad system did not serve us as wonderfully as loyalists may want. That was a little bit of a strain. Even now, my maternal side are very big loyalists. A lot of them are, in fact, in Britain now. So, I haven't really gotten into arguments with anyone, because I think they can hold their views and I'll hold mine. But as a student of history, I do remember my grandmother did not like it at all. And I started questioning her, and I said, no, but I'm studying this.
As we know right now, history keeps getting written and rewritten to suit whatever is happening in the country. But then when you come to the story of your Abid and Meera, so when their actual marriages take place in the family, the marriage of your parents. So now you have a Bhantu who has converted to Christianity. Somebody descended from them is marrying somebody who is Muslim. And you talk a little bit about it in the book as well. But I wanted you to talk about how that was taken by the larger family. Did it vary from aunt to aunt in reaction? Because the prejudice and suspicion about others is not something that just happened in the last 10 years. It's got deep roots in India, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And especially for people who had witnessed the horrors of partition. So the anti-Muslim sentiment was not new to India. We've witnessed a lot of communal writing well into the colonial rule as well. And I don't think that the colonial rulers were directly responsible for any of this. That's just Indians carrying their own biases against each other, suspicion against each other. So the Muslim community faced a lot of the weight of partition for years after the partition horrors. And my aunts actually held a lot of biases against the Muslim community at large as a direct consequence of what they were reading around the partition. I don't think they had exposure to Muslims as such, but the stories of what was happening in the rioting and the fact that Muslims were getting a nation based on religion. So these things did play on people, and they were very angry with my grandmother for approving my mother's marriage and actually going ahead with the marriage against all their opinions. Since they were also helping Prudence out with the education of her other children because of a domestic situation, they felt that they had a right and an opinion in this relationship. And Meera was like their child, everyone's child. And they wanted her to become a doctor because Meera was a bright student as well. So they felt let down. And one of the ways in which they showed this anger was in speaking up against my father's community as well and holding that bias. Unanimously, I think they were all against the marriage.
And what about Abid's family side? What did they make of a woman named Meera being brought into their fold? This was around what year?
1969. They had met my mother because there was a relationship period where my father had introduced his mother to my nani, and his younger siblings had come and stayed over at my mother's house. So they had met. It wasn't a sudden decision where he just married someone and brought her home. So they were kind of processed the idea of having a Christian daughter-in-law. I think my father was rebellious and he didn't really wait for everyone's approval. And this was also not the first interreligion, interfaith marriage in their family, because their Mamu's eldest son had also married a Christian. So things were a little easier here, also because of my father's determination to make it smooth. So people had reservations about this, but it wasn't many times that it was verbalized.
But even in your maternal side, like Prudence's eldest sister had also married a Muslim.
But, there's not much information on that relationship. And she left and she was the oldest.
So she was much older than him.
Yeah, there was a 16-year difference between Prudence and Panna. And Panna wasn't even helping out Prudence. And Meera, like I said, was everyone's child. In their mind, it was like, this is our daughter, this is our child, and we want to make her do something else in life. And here she wants to get domesticated. There was a little anger in them not being subservient to their word, to their opinions as well. So this was more than just her marrying Muslim. It was also, you're not listening to us suddenly.
But even though your father's family came from there was a traditional joint family and all of that and an ancestral home, looking back, what do you think was your father's relationship to his Muslim identity in a sort of changing India? Because he moves you at one point so that when you're the only Muslim family in a non-Muslim area.
My father, his Muslimness, if I can say, was limited to his own idea of religion for himself. It wasn't a communal idea of his children all, learning theology and simultaneously going to schools. Or, there were some relatives who were reluctant in taking modern education, English mediums. My father was the opposite. He was a very bright student in the village where he grew up. And he always viewed education as the next stepping stone, which is what Prudence's family had already seen. And my grandfather was also actually a lecturer in English. So education, academics were very heavy in their house as well. And my father wanted to leave Lucknow, wanted his family to not be held back for reasons of religion, theology, and Muslimness. Now that there was my mother in his family who was this educated woman from another community, my father actually worked on the advantages of that exposure. And which is why when they left the ancestral house, he chose to eventually not live in a ghetto and get integrated in society. And that was the way he was. He was an educator, and for him, education stood as the key to other things. And religion is as personal as it can be. Like, I remember him offering his namaz. I remember my mother offering her namaz. And we learned things on the way. Never as now you're 12, you learn, or now you're 9, you have to learn.
In fact, the subhead of this book is family, caste, and conversions, but it is as much a story about family, caste, and conversions and education, because it plays such an enormous role on both sides of the family. Even though your father kept religion as something very personal, your mother, Meera, sort of embraced a certain interest in this religion that she was marrying to, which seemed to have come from herself, not something that was coming because she was from your father.
Yes, that is true. Because I think that also came with the excitement of being a convert and learning things and wanting to pass that knowledge out, because it was also new and fresh for her as well. But my father, for him, it was a lifestyle. It wasn't anything new. So for me, my religious identity became like a nice amalgamation of both their approaches towards Islam. For my mom, it was really an enthusiasm, like, this is something that I'm going to start teaching them. Now's the right age, going by the book. And for my father, it was like, they can learn. They will educate themselves as well. Of course, they taught us the basics and how to pray, but that wasn't our primary marker for identity.
Did you feel out of place, though, among your cousins, like not Muslim enough?
Yeah. So this is interesting that, when I was on another podcast, we were talking about Muslimness and Muslim identity and how there's always something there to other you. Like there, if not being Muslim enough, it will be not Sayyid enough. There's always something that humans find to kind of feel superior from the other.
Your parents get married in 1969. At that time, I don't know if there was all this rhetoric we have now about love jihad or, where an interreligious marriage brings hoodlums to your door and it attracts so much state attention. But at that time, it feels like it was probably still a very personal matter between the families.
Yes, I think so. From whatever stories I have followed, there would be family members who would be angry and wouldn't speak to you for a few years, and then the grandchild would appear and all sins would be forgiven and forgotten. So that was mostly the trend, even in intercaste marriages, But the state being involved was definitely not there. And I mean, I've followed the India Love Project, where we've seen love stories from the 70s and 80s, which didn't really shake the earth as they would do now.
And I mean, I imagine at that time, whether they approved of these marriages or not, I don't think that people would have felt the necessity of starting something like India Love Project either. As in, like we need to, this was neither to be celebrated nor condoned.
Yeah, you're right. It was more commonplace, Again, it was also India finding its footing. And so many of these things as a society have evolved. So many political parties and so many different kind of politics have evolved, and people taking advantage of certain sentiments, that now we've reached a point because of the labor of those sections of society from the 1970s onwards. So what we're seeing now is a result of some decades of work.
And there's a really sort of moving anecdote in the book where you talk about how you're this Muslim family, but you all, when the Ramayana is being telecast, everybody comes to watch it on TV at your home. So it's this Muslim family that has opened up the doors to this very diverse group of people watching the Ramayana, which sounds like a wonderful sort of unity in diversity kind of story. But did you have conversations with your father, or did you have a sense of how he felt this relationship was going, where as a Muslim who moved out of the ghetto, stayed in a non-Muslim area, to going towards a place where so many Muslims who did that have moved back into ghettos now because they feel safer in that? I mean, your father didn't live to see all of that, but he lived to see some of it happening.
Yes, that is true. There are many political events that take place now, and my immediate reaction is, what would Papa be thinking about this? My father grew up in a village, Fatehpur, and he went to the government school and college there, and Gita classes were part of it. And my father was so well versed in Hindu epics and mythologies, and he enjoyed them. And that excitement, I mean, when I was in school, we studied these stories as well, right, in school, and I always found them fascinating. And my father's excitement, and my father knowing these shlokas verbatim, and he was so well versed in Sanskrit as well, there was no way we ever felt that watching the Ramayana was not agreeable or not something that Muslims should be enjoying. That sentiment was totally absent. My father loved hosting laborers and neighbors from close by areas, and all of us just watching these stories together. We never really saw it as another religion's story. These were just so fantastical that I don't know any Indian who wouldn't be enjoying them in their hearts. But he was very cautious of the Muslim identity in public when we started growing up, and when we started taking trains and traveling alone. When I started studying in Delhi for undergrad, he would come and drop me in the train till he realized that, there are many girls going together and he can relax a bit. But he used to always be cautious of the PNR chart outside having my name and age. And that fear, as I've written in the book as well, turned out to be true when these shootings happened and Muslim passengers were targeted. And I actually felt that this was a fear lurking in him somewhere. At that point, I used to get irritated with him being so protective. And I'm like, so what if it's Nusrat Jafri and not NFJ or something, where he would, or Sona, that's my pet name. He would say, right, Sona J, so that nobody knows if it's Hindu, Muslim, Christian. And he was deeply interested in politics. So he was watching. He lived through the Babri times and the Godra times. So suspicion did start creeping in.
Reading the book, what I felt was that it was also a comment on the growth of identity politics in India, and at the expense of a somewhat more idealistic view that might have been held during independence, that we would develop an identity as Indians who happen to be Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, Christian, whatever, but instead what seems to have grown stronger are these identities. And in fact, just as you say, your father was proficient in Sanskrit. Possibly today, somebody like him would be frowned on within his own community.
So in Uttar Pradesh, there's a sizable population of Muslims, which is more than the average of 14. You have 19.2% Muslims in UP. In Lucknow specifically, there's been no history of communal violence, communal riots. There have been Shia-Sunni riots, but never Hindu-Muslim riots. And the beautiful thing about being a Lucknowi is your exposure to the Ganga-Jamni Tehzeeb. So this is the culture where you have tolerance and you celebrate each other's language and culture. It's not unusual to find Muslims and Hindus who enjoy Urdu and Sanskrit. So luckily, a lot of that is preserved in Lucknow even now. So I do have optimism in this area where Lucknow and Uttar Pradesh are concerned. I'm like, as long as Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb is upheld, I think we do have some hope.
You work as a cinematographer in films. You do films like Jodha Akbar. I don't know whether a film like Jodha Akbar could be easily made today anymore.
I did the behind the scenes on Jodha Akbar. There was a lot of, it was difficult to make Jodha Akbar as well at that time because of Karni Sena. But now it would be even more difficult because I know projects like Takht, which were based on the Mughal history, Aurangzeb have been, they've been stalled for some time now. So it is difficult. I don't have the facts on numbers on this, but I think it's very difficult to make a story touching Indian Mughal history or having entirely Muslim protagonists with any reference to history right now.
What about this story? Say, if you were doing even a fictionalized version of your family story, would that be difficult in the current climate? Because there are so many stories of conversion that are happening in the story, and they are not necessarily negative stories in that, you're not necessarily saying, oh my God, conversion, terrible thing.
So that's the thing about the word conversion in today's India. It is so heavily loaded. The connotation is almost always negative. For even a liberal person to assume or acknowledge that that particular adult would have exercised agency and wanted to convert is so difficult. There's always a but, there might have been expectations from the other family, but maybe this one did it to make their life easy. These are the questions that I've had to answer to some of the biggest liberal friends that I have. I mean, it would be beautiful to make this land into a film if you were to take one or two layers of it only, and if you were to keep identity and caste or conversions only. But I think it's needed. I don't know which producer is ready to put their fingers in this.
In some ways, the story of your family should be the story of India, right? Because it involves all these different aspects. It's like one family tree whose branches pretty much cover all the major religions and historical tides that swept through India, through very ordinary people. Does it seem strange to you that after so many centuries together that your story is still somewhat exceptional? You don't hear of too many other families who have these stories, or maybe there are, but they just don't talk about it. I don't know.
Yes. So, this is a wonderful observation because the story of conversion is always a very secretive narrative that families like to withhold within themselves as well. I've had friends for years, and after they've like known me and known my personal history, would they like open up and say, but my mother was Hindu earlier. And this requires a lot of trust in the other person, because there is judgment, there is political baggage. And I remember Varun Grover at my book's launch in Bombay, while he was talking about the book, he said that while this is India, this is also not so unique. This is our stories. If we look within our families, we may have a mami or a chachi from another religion. We are just like not opening ourselves to those stories, to those identities, to the, like layers that they bring into it. And I actually am very optimistic. I also believe that this is the story of India.
And in a way, this is also a story about India and how a country deals with this change, because it's not like everybody in this story accepts the conversions or the marriages with open arms. Some people are okay with it. Some people are not. Some people approve. Some people come around to it. But I mean, there's a lesson there too, right? That is how we progress in bits and pieces at different speeds.
Yes, that is true. I mean, if we would be resilient to diversity, then we would be really boring. There would be nothing standing against the other. It would just be so, I don't know. This is what makes the uniqueness is what makes India and the society special.
Well, I hope this opens up to more people coming out with more stories about their tangled and mixed family trees. Nusrat Jafri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandip. This was a wonderful conversation.
The book is This Land We Call Home, the story of a family, caste, conversions, and modern India. The author, Nusrat F. Jafri. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.